My name is Joseph Miller, and I'm a policy analyst with the Show Me Institute. And I'm going to be speaking today with Michael Rathbone, who will be up here shortly, about whether the Rams are worth it. And before we get into the actual question of whether the new stadium plan, as it is worth the cost, I want to talk a little bit about the stadium that we currently have, the Edward Jones Dome. As you may or may not know, the Edward Jones Dome was built between 1991 and 1995 for $285 million. It was entirely publicly financed, and when they originally built it, they didn't have a sports team. So to lure the Rams from LA to St. Louis, they had to offer a pretty nice lease. And that lease included a lot of things like giving the personal seat licenses to the Rams. It also included a provision that they essentially pay for the moving costs. And the one that's most important for today is the top tier lease, the top tier part of the lease. And essentially what they said was, we're signing a 30-year lease, which for right now would end in 2025. But if the stadium falls out of the top tier, the top 8 of stadiums in the NFL, then we can break our lease in 20 years. And that's essentially what's happened today, because just a couple of years ago, as you might know, an arbitrator ruled that either the CVC, which is the Convention and Visitor Center, which runs the Dome, would have to pay $700 million in renovation costs, or build a new stadium, or the Rams could go year to year. The CVC opted not to take that plan, so the Rams have now gone year to year, and Stan Kroenke, who is the owner of the Rams, has bought land in LA, and is reportedly looking to build a new stadium there and move the Rams back, which is putting a lot of pressure on the St. Louis government to see what they can do to keep the Rams. Because of that, the governor appointed a task force, and they have sort of come up with a preliminary plan for the new stadium. That's going to be on the riverfront, just north of the Lumiere Casino, south of I-70. Its cost should be anywhere from $860 million to $985 million. And about half of that is supposed to come from public financing. The number we hear most often is $405 million. Aside from that, they're supposed to start construction very soon. It's completed by 2020. And there are ancillary benefits that could come from the stadium, like it could host some concerts, and it could possibly be used to lure an MLS team, although that's not currently on the table. It's important to note when talking about any part of this deal that this isn't the result of a negotiation between the Rams and the Missouri Task Force. This is simply the first put from that task force. Apparently, Stan Kroenke has not been very responsive to their offers, so this is pretty much as good as it's going to get. If negotiations go any further than this, it's probably just going to get worse for the taxpayers. So $405 million in public subsidies is probably the least that taxpayers can expect to put forward should this new stadium plan come to fruition. So are the Rams worth it? We're going to take that question from a couple different angles. The first thing to know is that we're taking the public cost as $405 million because that's going to be the public subsidy to build a new stadium. And we want to know whether it's worth it in terms of riverfront revitalization. Is it going to revitalize that sort of depressed area just north of Lumiere? If you've been there, obviously parts of it are very run down. We also want to know just wider regional economic impact. Is it going to increase jobs? Is it going to increase personal income? We want to know, is it going to increase tax revenue to the city and state so that it could pay $405 million back? And one thing we're not going to look at, but we do think is important, and other people will certainly think is important, and should be remembered, is civic spirit. The NFL is not just about dollars and cents. A lot of people really have a lot of pride in their NFL team. People think that to be a top-tier city, you need to have an NFL team, that if you lose one, it could hurt people's pride. It could stop people from wanting to move to the area. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about downtown revitalization, and I have this video.
I'm Joseph Miller from the Show Me Institute, and I'm standing here in the Bottle District in downtown St. Louis. You may have heard that the Rams might be leaving town, and that to keep the Rams in St. Louis, the city and the state want to build a new stadium right across the highway there on the riverfront. and using public dollars to finance that project. There's a lot of arguments for and against that, but one of the prominent ones that's used in the city is that it's going to revitalize the city center, that it's going to be the crown jewel of a new St. Louis. But the city's tried these kind of big developments before, and they failed to spark revitalization. And there's probably no better example of that than St. Louis' existing stadium, the Edward Jones Dome. And the failure of the Edward Jones Dome to spark a revitalization in downtown St. Louis isn't a failure of execution. It's virtually unanimous among economists that stadiums do not spark building booms in any city. So, when St. Louis is considering whether or not it wants to spend $405 million to build and Rams a new stadium on the riverfront, people should really question whether or not revitalization will follow that effort.
All right, so that's the video. It's really short. That's just taken on the north side of the Edward Jones Dome. Some people point to Washington Avenue as a possible place where development has occurred because of the Rams Stadium. However, the modest success in that area has been very highly subsidized through tax increment financing. So clearly the stadium wasn't enough to bring sort of that thing by itself. And also you would expect that it should have raised property values at least a little bit on the north side so that it wouldn't be empty and vacant. But apparently that really hasn't happened. And it doesn't happen in a lot of cities for a few reasons. One, there's really not a lot of evidence that people like to live right next to big NFL stadiums. I mean, people can say that. It's hard to put shops up next to it, especially because you usually need quite a bit of parking and surface parking, which pushes things out a little bit further. So there's a lot of times development is not something that you'll follow in any city, Chicago or St. Louis or anything else. So the next question I'm going to talk about is just economic development. That's just, are we going to bring in jobs to this region? Are we going to bring in more income? And once again, the literature out there is that that's probably not going to be the case. And that might seem counterintuitive. And I've heard people say, you can't just let a billion-dollar company walk out of St. Louis and expect to see no loss. But one of the things to remember about sports stadiums is that they are an entertainment good, and they mostly serve the residents of the region as they already exist. It's not like you have an Intel factory here that's exporting something and bringing in money from the outside. And because of that, you have economic effects that sort of push down any type of development that can come from it. First, an important one is substitution. Because people are spending their entertainment dollars on the Rams, they might not be spending it at a restaurant, at a bowling alley, or anywhere else. So if you're just diverting revenue from some entertainment good to another entertainment good, that's not new economic dollars for the city. And that's going to mean that the job growth from that is basically going to be very low or non-existent, and the new personal income is going to be very low, non-existent, especially if you're not bringing in a lot of people from out of town. The next thing, obviously, to talk about is crowding out. And that's even if you have a very large event, say you have a Super Bowl or even just a playoff game, you bring a lot of people out from out of town, and it can look like your city's making a lot of money, but the problem is that you're oftentimes crowding out other taxpayers, other people who would have been visiting the city and who would have been spending money without any taxpayer subsidies at all, and the city itself has to pick up the bill for all the extra security. And because of these two factors, mostly, that's what's going to bring down the total positives of a new stadium, and make it so that it's very hard to find any positive economic impact, and why it's, among economists, it's been very hard to see that stadiums anywhere have a very positive effect. And with that, I'm going to have Michael Rathbone talk to you about tax revenue for the city coming from the stadium.
Thank you, Joe. So what we tried to do was find out the extra tax revenue that could possibly be gained to the city, state, and county after making an initial investment of the $405 million on behalf of the public. So in order to do that, we had to make several assumptions in terms of gauging how much revenue we would get back. One of those was estimating the useful life of the stadium. The current Edward Jones Dome, if this plan goes through, would have an effective useful life of 25 years. So we assumed that for this new stadium, that useful life would remain 25 years. We also had to assume a discount rate. Now, what a discount rate is basically an interest rate working in reverse. And we assumed that was 6%, which was pretty much found for projects of this sort. We also made several other assumptions. We had to estimate average attendance at these games, and we based that off of NFL figures and what the Rams were pulling in previously. We also had to estimate the amount of spending that would go on at these games, and we based that off of an index on an NFL index, which looks at consumption at various stadiums. We also looked at income tax revenues, and so in order to do this, the big driver of this was the salary cap, players' salaries. And so we made different estimations on how fast and how much the salary cap would grow. And so that was a big driver. And we also estimated coaches' salaries and any other salaries for other employees that happen to work at the stadium. And then we also took into account foregone property tax revenue, because when they build the stadium, they are building it on new property with existing buildings. So those buildings are generating property tax revenue, and if you destroy that, you're foregoing that revenue. So before I go into the different scenarios we used, the key assumptions really turned out to be, one, the amount of the salary cap growth. If it grows by a little, the income tax revenue we see doesn't grow by a lot, and so it can have a significant impact on our final analysis. Also, we had to assume how many people were coming in from out of town. That was a big driver because, as Joe mentioned before, if people are just coming from St. Louis County or different parts of the city to go to the games, that's not new economic activity. And so that's what we had to find, is we had to make a guess on how many people were coming from out of town to watch the Rams. So this is our first scenario. We call it the rosy scenario. So what we're doing here is basically giving the Rams the benefit of the doubt on everything. We're assuming that everybody going to the Rams game is coming from out of the area. We're assuming that the salary cap is growing at over 5% a year. We're assuming high amounts of consumption, and then that all the money stays in the area. So there's no leakages, nobody's taking that money and spending it out of town. And as we see here, over time, taxpayers will see a positive return on this. However, in scenario 2, we did the opposite. We were very pessimistic. We assumed that nobody from out of town would come and watch the Rams. We assumed a slower rate of growth for terms of salary cap. We assumed that all of the money generated in the area, so players' salaries, consumption, and the like, all that money was not spent in the area, so there was any ancillary economic benefit to that spending. And as you see, the taxpayers over the useful life will still be down over $200 million. So we have one scenario where the taxpayers are making out like a bandit, another one they're pretty much losing their shirts. But there's scenario 3, and that's where we try to do our best guess of what would actually happen. So for instance, we had the salary cap grow at a little over 2% a year, which is based on the last CBA, the collective bargaining agreement between the players and the owners, the average growth rate since then. We based it on assuming that some people from out of town would come and watch the Rams, but not everybody not all the attendance would be from out-of-state visitors. And we also assumed that some of the money's given in the area, so the players spend some of their salaries here, some of the spending is from people out of town, so that reverberates around the economy. So it was not it's not an averaging, but we just assumed, we tried our best guess on how much each factor impacted the overall benefit. And so we found that over time they pretty much they come close to breaking even. Overall, the taxpayers still lose about $2.5 million over the long haul. But again, you tweak the assumptions, you can be a little above, a little below. So, but according to our best guess, the taxpayers still lose out by a couple $1 million. So overall, we found that public financing of sports stadiums does not lead to economic development or large economic growth. The literature is pretty unanimous on that. And so we didn't find anything to contradict that. We also found that in certain scenarios, in certain situations, that the public could see a lot of extra tax revenue from this, but also equally likely, the taxpayers could end up losing money on this. And so it really depends on the assumptions you make and what overall actually happens, the type of behavior with these stadiums. There are also something we didn't really talk about, but it's worth noting, is that there's opportunity costs. They're trying to make an investment of $405 million, and that $405 million can be spent somewhere else. The city and the county can be spending on other tourism-related activities, or they can just cut taxes. The state spends general revenue on this to finance the stadium, and so that can go to higher education, it can go to public safety, or it can be returned to the taxpayers. And so there's a variety of uses for that money instead of just spending it on a stadium. And then so, in the end, there's significant risks. We can't say for certain that the taxpayer is going to lose money, but there's a decent chance they could. And overall, when you determine whether the Rams are worth it, it really should be made on whether you like the NFL, you like football, and you want a luxury good in the area. So, thank you.